History books tell a clean story. 1776. Declaration of Independence, a nation is born. But what if I told you that just a few weeks after that famous signing, the entire American Revolution was on the brink of complete and utter collapse? This isn't just a dramatic retelling. We're talking about a single, desperate 24-hour period where everything, and I mean everything, hung by a thread. The British weren't just coming. They were already there, and they had a fleet so massive it was described as a forest of masts. The newly formed Continental Army. It was a shadow of its former self, trapped, demoralized, and staring annihilation right in the face. This is the story of the day. America almost lost its independence before it even truly began. This is the forgotten crisis of 1776. Let's set the scene. It's late August, 1776. The ink on the Declaration of Independence is barely dry, but the mood in New York City is anything but celebratory. It's pure dread. General William Howe has landed a massive British force on Staten Island. We're talking over 32,000 professional soldiers. It's the best-trained army in the world, supported by the most powerful navy on the planet. Facing them was George Washington's Continental Army. An army is a generous term. It was a ragtag collection of about 19,000 militiamen and volunteers. Most were farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants. They were passionate, yes, but they were amateurs going up against seasoned professionals. Their training was minimal, their supplies were scarce, and their contracts were short. They were defending a cause, but they were hopelessly outmatched in every conventional sense. Washington knew it. The British knew it. The whole world was watching to see this rebellion get snuffed out. The inevitable clash came in late August, the Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. It was the first major battle after the Declaration of Independence, and it was a disaster for the Americans. Washington, misjudging the British strategy, split his forces between Manhattan and Long Island. The British, with their superior numbers and brilliant flanking maneuvers, completely outsmarted and overwhelmed the American defenders on Long Island. The colonists fought bravely, particularly a small group of Maryland soldiers who held the line against impossible odds, buying precious time, but it was a rout. The Americans suffered over 1,000 casualties, with many more captured. The British lost fewer than 400. By the evening of August 29th, the situation was catastrophic. The remnants of the American force on Long Island, nearly 10,000 men, were trapped. They were pinned against the East River with their backs to the water. In front of them, the victorious British Army was digging trenches, preparing for the final crushing blow. Behind them, the British Royal Navy, with its powerful warships, controlled the waters, ready to cut off any escape. It was a perfect trap. There was no way out. The largest contingent of the Continental Army was about to be wiped off the map. They fell, the revolution was over. Washington, who had crossed over from Manhattan to witness the disaster unfold, was now trapped with his men. The cause of liberty was hours away from being just a footnote in British history. Imagine the despair in the American camp that night. Rain was pouring down, turning the trenches into mud. The men were exhausted, hungry, and terrified. They had just seen their comrades fall, and they knew they were next. For Washington, this was the ultimate test. Defeat was one thing, annihilation was another. He had a choice: surrender and end the war in disgrace, or attempt the impossible. He held a tense council of war with his officers. The decision was unanimous but audacious. They would attempt a nighttime evacuation. A full-scale retreat across the treacherous mile-wide East River, right under the noses of the British Army and Navy. It was a suicidal plan on paper. They needed boats, but most had been destroyed or were unavailable. They needed to move thousands of men, their supplies, and their cannons in complete silence. The slightest noise, a misplaced or a cough, could alert the British sentries who were just a few hundred yards away. And they needed to do it all in one night before the sun came up and exposed them to the full wrath of the British forces. Washington sent out desperate orders. He commanded his men to scour the riverbanks for any and every boat they could find. Fishing skiffs, rowboats, barges, anything that could float was commandeered. A specialized regiment of mariners from Marblehead, Massachusetts, led by Colonel John Glover. Men who were fishermen and sailors by trade were tasked with manning these vessels. The fate of the revolution now rested on the shoulders of these New England fishermen. As darkness fell, the impossible operation began. The men were ordered to maintain absolute silence. The wheels of the cannons were wrapped in rags to muffle their sound as they were dragged through the mud to the ferry landing. Soldiers spoke only in whispers. The tension was unbearable. Every creak of a boat, every splash of an oar felt like a thunderclap that would give them away. The winds and the tide on the East River were notoriously strong and unpredictable. The crossing was perilous even in broad daylight, let alone at night, in a storm overloaded with terrified men. For hours, the Marblehead mariners rowed back and forth, a ghostly armada in the dark. But progress was agonizingly slow. By the early hours of the morning, a large part of the army was still on the Long Island side, and the sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn was approaching. Panic began to set in. It seemed the gamble had failed. They were out of time. If the sun rose, the British would see the entire operation, and it would be a massacre on the water. The revolution was minutes away from ending. And then something happened that soldiers would later describe as a providential act of God. Just as the first light of dawn threatened to expose them, a thick, dense fog rolled in. It was an unusually heavy fog for that time of year, blanketing the river and the shoreline. It was so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face. It completely concealed the American retreat from the British. While the American side of the river was shrouded in fog, the British side, where their camps were, remained relatively clear. The British Army woke up, ready for their final assault, and saw nothing. The fog acted as a natural curtain, hiding the last boats filled with soldiers as they made their frantic final crossing to the safety of Manhattan. When the fog finally lifted around mid-morning, British soldiers advanced on the American fortifications, expecting a final bloody battle. Instead, they found them empty. The camp was deserted. The entire Continental Army of 10,000 men, along with all their cannons and supplies, had vanished. They had slipped through the net. General Howe was reportedly stunned and furious. He had them. The war should have been over. But in one night, under the cover of darkness and a miraculous fog, Washington had snatched his army from the jaws of defeat. This evacuation was not a victory in the traditional sense. It was a retreat. But it was perhaps the most important retreat in American history. It saved the Continental Army from destruction. It allowed the revolution to continue. Had it failed, had the fog not appeared, there would be no United States of America as we know it today. George Washington's leadership during those critical hours, his audacity, his calm under immense pressure, and his meticulous planning cemented his status as the indispensable leader of the cause. The escape from Long Island was a masterstroke of military deception and logistics that turned a catastrophic defeat into a symbol of American resilience. It proved that even when outmatched, this new nation had a spirit that would not be easily broken. The war was far from over, and many dark days were still ahead, but on that foggy morning in August 1776, a flicker of hope was saved from being extinguished forever. So the next time you think of 1776, remember it wasn't just about a declaration, it was about a desperate gamble, a silent evacuation, and a mysterious fog that changed the course of history. Thanks for watching. If you found this hidden story as fascinating as I do, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that truly shaped our world. See you next time.